Professor Emeritus Dorothy Scott. Look, she's seen plenty of hot water in her time. She's been at the forefront of policy and practice for 40 years, working with children and families at the highest levels of government. Today, her address is called Identity, Integrity and Inspiration, the Self at the Centre for Service. Your keynote speaker, the last session of what has been a most successful conference, I'm sure you'll all agree. Would you welcome to the stage Emeritus Professor Dorothy Scott.
Thank you, Libby. I've been described as many things, but a tea bag, that's got me going. Let's close our conference remembering that we gather this afternoon on the land of Indigenous people who walked this land for tens of thousands of years. And let us honour the spirits of the land itself, as well as their elders past and present, into time beyond time. I live on the land of the Wurundjeri people in the Yarra Valley, where Bunjil, the wedge-tailed eagle, is the creator spirit. And every time I see a wedge-tailed eagle soar in the sky, I am deeply, deeply aware that I live on Wurundjeri land, and that I will go back and live on the land of the Wurundjeri people, which will always be their land. It's a great honour to be asked to close this wonderful conference and to be given permission to reflect a little on the conference as it morphs into the themes of identity, integrity and inspiration. Put the textbook away, okay? And I guess some of the highlights for me are these. Listening to the children who started our days, and just some of the gems. I learned to work as part of a team. Yesterday, you know, Lonnie's the sort of place where you could borrow someone's mobile to ring your mum and dad. That's social capital. That's a precious, precious gift. I was here in March and I bought a new hat, and just as I went to cross the road, it blew and a car came and I went to get it, and then a bus came and this lovely young man of 18, 19, 20 came up and said, "I'll get your hat." I thought that wouldn't have happened in Collins Street, but it happens in Launceston. Social capital. I'll remember Michael and his big picture collective impact, his passion and his lack of fear of conflict. Normalising it. Let's embrace it. Not necessarily always ignite it, but let's be comfortable enough to deal with it constructively. Karen Malone shared with us child-friendly cities, and the one gem out of the many that I carry with me is the Italian city, the name of which I can't remember, in which the children cared for a section of the river. Children as active citizens, not as consumers. Not as clients, Jim, as you've been telling us. Clients, consumers, but as citizens, as contributors. Andrew Fuller, I don't think I've laughed so much for a long time, but in one of his pieces of advice about one of those categories of kids was give children roles in which they can help out. And 2 years ago at this conference, I spoke about children as contributors, and I won't go over that again. But I drew on the research of Werner and Smith, the mothers of longitudinal studies in resilience in children, and their notion of required helpfulness for children who reach this age and are required to contribute to the well-being of another, be it an animal, be it someone in their family, be it in their school community or beyond. And that being one of the strongest correlates with resilience for children growing up in environments that might carry much adversity. And it's the one part of the resilience literature that we haven't started to implement. And I sometimes wonder why. We're still keeping kids in the role of clients and consumers rather than tapping their potential to be contributors. Michael and Dawn had a lovely phrase for that in their workshop yesterday afternoon. They called it an authentic alignment of contribution. Again, thinking about children and families as contributors not as clients and consumers. And we're going to have to turn the culture of some of our organisations upside down if we're going to rise to that challenge. There are costs of clienthood that are too heavy for people to bear. And I'm not talking about monetary costs. I'm talking about the psychological and social costs of clienthood. I remember Dawn saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. That wonderful African proverb and that beautiful image of migrating birds. And her emphasising the centrality of trust in relationships. And Jim this morning, building community, social movements, not more programs, social movements. Doing no further harm. And thank you for using Wodonga Neighbourhood House amongst your wonderful exemplars from your own country. So where do we go? Big picture stuff. Rob White challenged us with neoliberalism, big critique. And we can see we are in turbulent times, times that are going to challenge us deeply. Thinking about the state as all levels of government, federal, state and local, we are in a time of fiscal constraint which we have not seen for a long time in this country. That will have a major impact on our service system. In terms of the market, we are seeing the continual decline in manufacturing industry in a globalised economy which is destroying blue-collar jobs and corroding some communities to their very core. In civil society, Jim has told us about the work of Bob Putnam, Bowling Alone, which is reinforced by Australian data. So there are major challenges in the state, the market, in civil society, in whose interests each of those domains operates. And the silver lining in the cloud, without wanting to be too much of a Pollyanna, is some of the creativity that is happening at the interface of those domains. And I don't want to detract from Rob's powerful critique in focusing on some of those strengths. So we see, for example, where the state and civil society connect. I see my work with maternal and child health nurses, or CHAPS nurses as they would be called in Tasmania, my work in Victoria with these nurses who run first-time mother groups that 70% of all first-time mothers join. When Bob Putnam was in Melbourne over a decade ago, he and I met at a friend's for dinner, and he spoke about this. He said, do people in Premier and Cabinet know about this? And I said, Bob, probably not. He said, I don't know of a place in the Western world where a government-funded service is building social capital in neighbourhoods around the transition to parenthood. Beautiful example. I could go on for hundreds of more of where the state and civil society can work creatively together. Civil society, we're seeing some interesting intersections with the market around social enterprises. I work as a volunteer for a little nursery that's committed to saving the helmeted honeyeater. There's only 100 of these birds left in the world, in the wild, and they live just up the road on Wurundjeri land from where I live. And we run a nursery which then sells the plants that Melbourne Water and the local councils and others use, and that sustains our work to save this critically endangered species. That's a lovely example of a really small social enterprise. What's really great about it too is that we really draw in the kids and the teachers at the two bookend schools of that little bit of paradise, and those children are contributing to solving this problem. They're not despairing about another endangered species. They are saving this bird and its habitat. So at the interface between the state and civil society, between civil society and the market, and I say with some caution possibly between the state and the market around social benefit bonds, although the jury's still out on that. But as a patron of Burnside in New South Wales and its wonderful program Newpin, I'm hopeful that social benefit bonds may show one way forward as we try to engage more at the preventive end rather than at the bottom of the cliff. So, friends, we face very turbulent times, and the choice is ours. Will we retreat and compete for the crumbs that are left? Or will we collaborate and create? It's a time for some big questions. That's the macro, but I'm here to talk about the micro. But they all connect, as we've been talking about today and yesterday. So from the big system, the big picture, to the self for service. This is where the rubber hits the road. And when I'm talking about self for service, I'm not just talking about service providers serving. I'm talking about children and families and all citizens being called to serve, to be a contributor, to belong through the act of contribution. But I want to draw on research that comes from the very specific area of psychotherapy. This is Lambert's meta-analysis of the factors associated with positive outcomes in psychotherapy. So Lambert looked at hundreds of studies and distilled the factors and their weighting to these. That 40% of the outcome, regardless of the presenting problem, whether it was a relationship problem, depression, anxiety, thinking globally in an aggregate sense, that 40% of the positive outcome was related to factors within the client, personality, and the environment. Psychotherapy doesn't think it has much to do with the environment, social environment. Many of our services have a lot to do with that section of the equation. 40%. 30% of what contributed to positive outcome was the client's perception of the quality of the therapeutic relationship. And that's what I want to come back to. 15% was for the hope and expectancy of positive outcome. And there's hard data on this now from some of the trials on antidepressants where the placebo is having almost the same impact in some studies and sometimes the same as, in fact, the drug being tested. And that's not a matter of mind over matter. It's a matter of the matter of the mind, changes in biochemistry occurring in the expectation of positive change. So hope is an essential agreement. Are we harbingers of hope is the question we need to ask ourselves. And then last but not least is evidence-based practice. This is what the journals are full of course, but it makes up 15% of the outcome. So let's not forget the other 85%. So in our services, we need to be thinking, how do we intervene at each one of those segments? To intervene in the social environment around jobs and housing and social isolation, intervening in having the best possible relationships we offer, intervening in a way that nurtures hope, and where the evidence exists, do what we do in the light of that evidence and help build further evidence. That way we may have a collective impact. A PhD student of mine, Liz Reimer from northern New South Wales, did her thesis on the relationship between family support workers and the families they worked with. I don't think what I've just spoken about relates only to psychotherapy. Here's what one parent said in her thesis. These were mainly families where neglect had been a concern, child neglect had been a concern. And this is a woman talking about her family support worker. She just came across real. She just came across as the person you wished was living next door to you. There was no airs and graces. It's like, this is me and that's you, and I can meet you on the same level. I'm not above you. I don't have all the answers, but I might have some things that can help. She didn't take control off me. She tried to help me get more control. It wasn't that I felt powerless. It was more that I felt empowered. Then the more we went along, the more I felt like that. I think it's interesting yesterday that you as an audience demanded to know a bit about us who stand up here. And the subtext was basically, what right do you people have to stand up there and talk unless you've walked the talk and had some experience that connects with the people we're here talking about and walking beside? And it was a really good thing to make us talk authentically about ourselves. So Liz Reimer and I coined the phrase being real in role to describe the nature of the relationship which we are seeking. And that challenges some of the traditional role boundaries that some of us have been taught. And that we may need to say a little bit out of ourselves to be a real person while still in role if we're going to make that connection with families who need to trust us with some of the most painful and private aspects of their lives. But I want to move on from it in a therapeutic service provider sense, trying to rise to Jim's challenge, and think about the essential elements in all human relationships where growth is possible. I'm not one for acronyms, but I am using this one. GROW, standing for genuine, respectful, optimistic and warm relationships. And these are relationships which can exist anywhere. They can exist in a childcare centre. Deborah Phillips, who's part of the Shonkoff and Phillips grand team from Neurons to Neighbourhoods, talked about a study of a poor childcare centre in the US, in a low SES area, where most of the staff were clinically depressed. Under those conditions, how can the children in that centre flourish when those caring for them are depressed and demoralised? These relationships based on genuineness, respectfulness, optimism and warmth are like the precious resource of water or clean air or social capital. It's only when they start to be a diminished resource that we suddenly start to realise how precious they are. This is what we work through. We are the instruments of our own practice, and we transmit, or we strive to transmit, genuine, respectful, optimistic and warm relationships, and to try to nurture those in families, because we know from good research that it's high criticism, low warmth families that are the most destructive to children's development. Not necessarily physically abusive families or neglecting families. Listen to it. High criticism, low warmth. It's about the emotional qualities. And these relationships based on these qualities can exist in all sorts of places. What I didn't say yesterday is why we came from Wales to Australia. It was because my father was a prison officer in a prison in South Wales in a place called Swansea. And they were still hanging men in the 1950s in Swansea prison. I didn't actually mean to say this. My dad was the prison officer that men who were due to be hanged wanted to be with them the night before. That took a toll on my dad, which is why he left that job and we came to this land. But I feel deeply proud that he had the qualities that those men saw, and they wanted to spend their last night with a man who had those qualities. So these qualities are precious wherever they are. And these are emotions more than values. These are visceral more than cognitive. Where do they come from? Well, Rudy would probably say they come from our very earliest relationships, eh? And he would tell us that trauma-informed practice would tell us that it's through those relationships that traumatised people and children heal. I'm concerned that in some of our organisations, people come with these qualities, but they're not nurtured and sustained. I am concerned about high turnover in some of our organisations, but I'm more concerned about people who are there in body, but no longer there in soul. And they came with qualities, and some of those qualities have been diminished, not nurtured and enhanced. So these are challenges for our organisations, for our schools, for our services, for our childcare centres, for our streets, for everywhere. And Andrew Fuller talked about the shadow side of organisations. That was pretty hard-hitting, and I think he was right. And I think we need to look at the shadow side of our organisation. And we need to try to shine light on that and move it into growth. I have a close relationship with an organisation called St Luke's in Bendigo. Many of you will have heard about it because of its championing of strength-based practice and its advocacy for families and with families, and the pioneering of wonderful things like shared action, which would fit well with Jim's portfolio of community development. At St Luke's now, young care leavers help choose the staff. Staff help choose the staff too. But the young care leavers form a committee of management or a committee that actually then interviews the staff. And they're pretty clear about whether people have got the qualities of genuineness, respectfulness, optimism and warmth. They don't necessarily call it that. They say there's another one, that the people aren't scared of us. I like that. So it's how do we turn our organisations around so that they can be harbingers of hope and they can be crucibles of compassion and they can invite all to be contributors. I think that's our biggest challenge, whether it's collective impact or whether it's rebuilding communities. My way of thinking about this is that it actually starts with this. It starts with the self at the centre for service, not of a service, but for service. This is service for citizens, including children, not just services delivered by service providers. And it includes servant leadership. I think there's a challenge to those who lead in our services to exemplify and to nurture the 3 I's at the self for service: identity, integrity, and inspiration. Identity. Who am I? In Western psychological thinking, the 3 questions Lazarus would suggest to us are: who am I? Where am I going? Do I matter? A lot of I's in there, very reflective of an individualistic, narcissistic culture, one might suggest. I once came across in South Australia a rehabilitation program for Aboriginal people with alcohol-related problems, and they asked each person coming into that organisation to ask themselves 3 questions. The first one was, where do I come from? The second one was, who do I belong to? Not who belongs to me or what belongs to me, who do I belong to? And the third one was, who am I? Because you can't answer who am I until you answer the other 2 questions. The wisdom of the ancient civilization of this land, the longest living culture in the world, has a lot to offer us. So I invite you to think about the self, as in yourself, at the centre for service, and the alignment with the organisations that are part of the movement that we're trying to build. For we are the instruments of our own work. And it is work, Libby, you're right, it's work. We're like musical instruments. And some of us are harps and some of us are flutes. And is Mike still with us? Is he a trumpet? Is he the drums? He's certainly percussion or brass, you know. We're different instruments. But all our instruments need to be cared for. Sometimes to be mended if they're going to be able to make the best possible music. So think about yourself as an instrument, what you need to do for that instrument to make it perform beautifully. So these are some of the questions I invite you to ask, not just today, but perhaps to think about having a conversation in the days and weeks and months and years to come. Because I don't think we have conversations about these things as much as we should. And the first one is, I think, to ask, is what I do just a job? And if we're honest with one another, we'll say, yeah, sometimes it is. And it's important that we're honest to be able to say that. And sometimes in the one day, there can be times where it's just a job. And there can be times when it's a proud profession, or there's a sense of competence and skill which makes one feel that buzz. And sometimes it's more than that. And I'm not too fussed what we call the more than that. What I'm concerned about is that we help people have more of the sense of being part of something larger than themselves than having just a job or just a proud profession based on a service provider, service user relationship. Because that being more than this transcends beyond the boundaries of your role and your position and your organisation. That's what takes you into partnership with your communities. And some people call it vocation. And for some people, that word's not going to cut. There's an old Quaker phrase called that vocation is where the heart's desire meets the world's need. And I used to love that until a friend of mine, a Quaker who could have had a very comfortable retirement after many years of teaching, took up the cause of the eradication of landmines and cluster bombs. And when she talks and when she shows her slides and when she says to me, Dorothy, I cannot bear to see another photograph of a maimed child, I think, this ain't your heart's desire. This is your heart's torment. That some are brought to this work through something which is deeply painful, and that might be from their own personal history, but it might be feeling the pain of others so acutely that you can't turn your back on it. I remember hearing a woman once say why she'd got involved in the area of youth homelessness because she couldn't get into her bed thinking there were kids sleeping under the bridge in her town. That's what we're talking about when we talk about it being more than a job, more than a profession. And the pain can be a double-edged sword. It can leave us open and raw to being hurt, but it can also be what gives us the deep sense of empathy and understanding as we walk beside others. Parker Palmer, an American who is an author, an educator, an activist, in a book called Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, actually challenges the word vocation itself. So I want to reflect a bit on the way he has some problems with it. The idea of vocation I picked up in those circles, he's talking about earlier circles in his life, created distortion until I grew strong enough to discard it. I mean, the idea that vocation or calling comes from a voice external to ourselves, a voice of moral demand that asks us to become someone we are not yet, someone different, someone better, someone just beyond our reach. That concept of vocation is rooted in a deep distrust of selfhood, in the belief that the sinful self will always be made selfish unless corrected by external forces of virtue. It's a notion that made me feel inadequate to the task of living my own life, creating guilt about the distance between who I was and who I was supposed to be. So we need to debate the word and the baggage it might carry, but I think we need to say we can support each other in trying to be part of something bigger than ourselves, while accepting that at times on our life's journey we will have more or less of that commitment. And I remember vividly at the Queen Victoria Hospital in Melbourne, which is going back 35 years. Hospital's not there anymore, Melbourne. It was a very special organisation. And I had been with a team of people who'd created the first service for women and children who'd been sexually assaulted. We at that stage hadn't conceived of the notion of men being the victims of sexual assault. And I remember driving in on a Saturday afternoon as part of the 24-hour on-call crisis service that we developed and we were very proud of. and I was pregnant with my first child. And for the first time, I realised that I wasn't thinking about the woman I was about to see. I was thinking about me. And that she had become another client. And I knew at that moment that my vocation, for want of a better word, was evaporating very quickly. And at that time in my life, there was not going to be room for the amount of genuineness, respect, optimism and warmth which I previously had to offer. And I think it's important to be able to be honest with ourselves and with one another when that resource is diminished, and it might be time to take a break and to come back and perhaps to grow some vegetables in a community garden. So identity, I think, is at the core of this work, this hard work, this deeply rewarding work, this inspiring work. And what about integrity? And integrity in both its senses of something which is coherent and integrity as in ethics, as in the notion of trust, perhaps the most central source of integrity. What does integrity mean to each of us in our work, particularly when we're working with children and families that have every reason to distrust for the reasons Rumi has shared with us, but also from some of their experiences with our services? How do we ensure that we take integrity to that work, honesty? What does integrity mean to our organisations? I hope it isn't just the words on a wall in a mission statement. For if there is a gulf, a discrepancy between the organisation's mission as in words and its lived reality as experienced by those who work within or receive services from that organisation, it's worse than not having those words on a wall. There are real dangers in our organisation, and Jim referred to them: the risk of professionalisation, which brings knowledge and skills, but at a price. There's also the risk of bureaucratisation and the risk of secularisation, which cuts out a space for the spiritual. I'm not talking about religion, but for the spirit, for the soul. Professionalisation, secularisation, bureaucratisation. It's very important that we sustain the soul of our organisations, particularly those within civil society, so that they don't, as the last scene of George Orwell's Animal Farm, stand on their hind legs like the pigs and become of the state or of the market. Civil society is very precious. It should never transform itself into being of the state or of the market, while working in creative partnership with the state and with the market, and sometimes in tension with and in creative conflict with the interests of the state and the market. So these are big challenges. And what does integrity mean to the services community to which I belong? In an era of competitive tendering, are we being honest with each other? Or are we again corroding the core of the trust and reciprocity on which collaboration will depend? These are the challenges. Last but not least is inspiration. So I invite you to think about if you'd been up on the panel yesterday afternoon and Libby had asked you those questions that she asked us in the first opening part of the final session. How did you come to this work in the first place? What led you along this path? What is this journey about? And each and every one of us will have a different journey and a different answer to that question. But we also may find a lot of similarities. So what inspires me? Who inspires me? What sustains my spirits? How do I sustain others? Can they be questions that we talk about? Sometimes in our relationships with other organisations, we tell atrocity stories. And we've all done it. It strengthens our sense of cohesion when we say to each other, "You won't believe what they've gone and done now." And we've all told them and we've all listened to them. But when our conversations are saturated in the atrocity stories, we kill the culture of collaboration. So can we check ourselves when we do that? Can we try to take the position of the other? And to do that, I think it means reconnecting with what brought us to this work in the first place. When I ask myself the question, what inspires me, one of my answers to that is seeing in the last 40 years the extraordinary achievements in a number of the areas that I have been most concerned with. And Jim, they were all movements. They weren't policies, they weren't programs, although there were policies and programs that were part of it. But they were movements. They were the movements of deinstitutionalisation, particularly child welfare for me, whereas the 14 or 15-year-old that turned up to the Alambi Reception Centre, I became shocked that there were children in my neighbourhood living in such extreme emotional turmoil, waiting and waiting for their cases to be heard, to come up before the Children's Court, many months often. Parents are allowed to visit 1 hour in a week, children holding on to wire fences at 3 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon, the hour at which visitors came, sometimes waiting all that hour and no one came. And as a young childcare worker, I was angry at the parents for not coming. I later walked beside parents and understood why it was so difficult for them to come. And the deinstitutionalisation of child welfare, like the deinstitutionalisation in mental health and intellectual disability, have been extraordinary movements, sometimes with unholy alliances, like under Ronald Reagan, the cost-cutting, as well as the humanitarian movement of reform. So sometimes they've been tough, difficult processes, but they were achieved. Sometimes communities resisted them because their employment was created within those institutions. I can think of places in Victoria where that was the case. I'm able to remember when child physical abuse started to be recognised as a problem. And by the 1970s, there was a strong recognition across professional communities and across the public generally around the battered baby. I remember well and being part of the movement in the wake of second wave feminism to lift the lid on child sexual abuse, which has probably taken 30 years to come to the point where we now are with a royal commission into the institutional responses to child sexual abuse in our nation. Others, some of you, were central in the movement also in the wake of second wave feminism in relation to family violence. These were movements. And last but not least was a movement for children's rights, a movement that started in the 19th century, where the twin notion of the child as a holder of human rights and the child as an emotional being have come together and come to fruition that has been explored yesterday at this conference. I look at those movements and I think, wow, how did we collectively achieve that? So that's what inspires me. And you have to think historically to be able to see those changes. And on the micro level, the micro level of what inspires me is to see tiny steps taken by children by one of the children I work with as a volunteer twice a week. And when she masters her times tables, and when she carries a history of trauma, so there are days where we don't even attempt tables, what do? We clean the turtle's tank. Because she can't concentrate on learning because there's been too much going on at home. But she can still clean the turtle's tank. She can be a contributor. And at the end of that hour, she can look and see the clean water, and she can see what she's achieved that day. I'm inspired by the steps she takes, given the adversity in which she lives. And who has inspired me? And I want you to think about the people who've inspired you as I say this. And I mentioned yesterday Di O'Neill, whom I encountered when I was 13 or 14, and she was the Melbourne University social work student running the YWCA girls group. And over 40 years I've seen Di O'Neill on the horizon and then close up and on the horizon. I'll just give you a thumbnail sketch of this wonderful woman. So in the mid-60s, there she is doing this with the girls in the Y. But then she's the first social worker appointed at the Victorian Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, now called the Children's Protection Society, where well-meaning upper-class women used to sit once a week and talk about how they live and share the atrocity stories of those people's lives. And Di O'Neill changed that. She set it up so that every week they talked about the amazing progress that some families had made, which they might have been a small part in achieving. She turned the narrative around to a strength-based story. She then established Parents Anonymous, which I don't think exists anymore, but it's built on the Alcoholics Anonymous sort of model, and it was a telephone service for parents who thought they were at severe risk of harming, particularly their babies. And someone else told me this, not Di, that she'd go to a town with a woman who was one of the parents who had joined Parents Anonymous, and Di would go there with her own child, and she wouldn't let on that she was the worker at PA and that person was the client. If people wanted to think that she was also one of Parents Anonymous, so be it. She walked beside. She never pulled rank. This is a woman who at St Luke's has been the mother of strength-based practice and created, with others she would say, but she's got a very big part of it, a culture in an organisation based on genuineness, respect, optimism and warmth. And she says it's in the little things. She was joking when I met with her back in November, just before their annual conference, which I was due to speak. She was joking with her colleagues that she'd have to come out of retirement and come back. And then she explained to them, "Don't you remember," she said, over dinner at the pub, "don't you remember I said I couldn't retire until you," and it was a group of women at the table, "learned to push down the paper towels in the loo so there was space for someone else's paper towel?" He who would do good for another must do it in minute particulars, Blake once said. Di O'Neill knows that in her body and her soul. And at a conference at the University of Newcastle, maybe over a decade ago, at a family strengths conference, when some homophobic remarks had been made, Di stood from this big audience in her gentle, firm, powerful way and came out as a lesbian and as someone who was hurt by those comments that had been made, and you could hear a pin drop. Very courageous woman who knew that the moment had come for her to try and change those in that room. Last Christmas, on Christmas Day, and remember she's retired, there were a number of children in the local child protection service who were supposed to have supervised access on Christmas Day with their parents. Well, you can just imagine how difficult that is, those of you who work in child protection, to pull that off. What did Di do? In 4 different rooms inside St Luke's, she, with the parents, not for them, set up 4 tables of Christmas decorations, and there were 4 dinners going on simultaneously. And some of those children and some of those parents said they'd never had a Christmas as good as that Christmas. This is someone whose source of inspiration comes from somewhere very deep in the very being. And we all know people like that. We all know families like that. Families raising a number of children with severe disabilities. That's their life, day in, day out. They are the heroes and heroines of their own lives. So who inspires us might in fact be those that we are called to serve, not just those who serve. It's the families, I think, who've inspired me most, and in particular a group of women that I worked with when I was in a psychiatric setting who had severe postnatal psychiatric disorders, and their transition into motherhood was a descent into hell. I formed a group of those women. One of the most moving moments of my life was the day they came together. And 35 years later, they still meet once or twice a year. Got a phone call the other week saying, we're going to have lunch. Dorothy, would you like to join it? At first I used to be anxious because what would the psychiatrists say if they knew I was having lunch with them? All those role boundaries. I can't believe that now. Did I know those women were meeting in the cafeteria in the hospital after my group? Horror. You know, like, it's just unbelievable sometimes, the notions we develop in our services about what people should and shouldn't do. For 35 years, those women, long after they ceased to be clients or patients of a service, have given each other what I used to call support. What a mealy-mouthed word, support. They haven't given each other support. They've loved each other for over 35 years. They've given each other love as they've gone through psychotic episodes and tragedy and the death of the first member of the group, and another member of the group stood up and gave the eulogy and spoke about the love. Why are we so afraid of words like love? So families who have that power of love, that compassion. And a young man that I encountered who'd had a really tough adolescence in out-of-home care. That's his story to tell, not mine. But he wanted to do social work and I became his mentor. And every time we met, he'd want to spend time not talking so much about his studies, although he went through a borderline pass-through to being a first-class honours student over that 4-year period. But he mostly wanted to talk about the young 10-year-old boy that he mentored, a very disturbed boy, a very aggressive boy, a boy who's now in juvenile justice and whom the young man I mentored is still in contact with him. So what was helpful to, let's call him Mike, the young man I mentored? My mentoring relationship with him? Maybe. But when I think about the content of the discussion all the time we met, I reckon it might have been his mentoring of that young boy, through which he helped heal himself, through which he saw himself as a giver and a contributor. I think that was the gift. So what really sustains us? How do we sustain others? Well, it'll be different for all of us, but out there is art and music and poetry and nature, all the gifts that the human spirit, in its mysterious, creative way, has created or in nature can appreciate. I love poetry and I love nature and I love them to come together, and I'm inspired by words like Rumi when he says there are countless ways to kneel and kiss the earth. There are countless ways to go home again. I'm not quite sure what it means, but I love it. So, where do we end? Well, I think what sustains me is that we are each a very small link in a long intergenerational chain, a mysterious chain, a chain of extraordinary possibility that's come from the miracle of evolution to this point, and where might it go? I once saw on the plaque of a house in York the house in which a man called John Woolman, an American Quaker who was a great supporter of the abolition of slavery. And I was just wandering around York as I was visiting the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and getting my head around philanthropy, and I saw this little plaque. John Woolman died here, this abolitionist. I thought, what's he doing over here? And then I noticed the year he died, 1772. He devoted himself to the abolition of slavery. He did not see it achieved. That is extraordinarily inspiring, that human beings will commit themselves to a cause which they will not see in their own lifetime. So I want to share with you one of my very favourite quotes by Mead and Heyman that picks up on this notion that we are links in an intergenerational chain. And it goes like this, that the task of the family, like the task of humanity, is to remember those who have gone before, to cherish the living, and to prepare for those not yet born. May we rise to this challenge, my friends. May your spirits be sustained in this long journey. Thank you.